Hello, and welcome to the first ever episode of Despot's Bookshelf, a podcast where we will review the literary ramblings of some of the most dreadful dictators the world has ever seen. Saddam Hussein was widely considered one of the greatest tyrants of the 20th century, coming to power as president of Iraq in 1979, following his instrumental role in the 1968 coup, which saw the Ba'ath Party take control of Iraq. Hussein ruled the country with an iron fist until the invasion of 2003. Best known for his brutal ascent to power, opposition to Israel, oppression of the Kurds, and penchant for gold-plated guns, he's less well known for his contributions to democratic political philosophy. Not many people know that Hussein, in the 70s, gave a series of 3 speeches discussing his views on the perfect democracy and how to achieve that in Iraq. These speeches were brought together and published in the book, On Democracy. I'm Arnie Craven, and in this episode of Despot's Bookshelf, I'll be discussing Saddam Hussein's wonderfully titled On Democracy with Jack Bannon.
Ahoy.
Jack Carrington.
Hello.
And Chris Whitwood.
Pleasure to be here.
Jack Carrington. In 1977, Saddam attempted to begin outlining his views on democracy in his seminal speech titled Democracy, a Source of Strength for the Individual and Society. Which part of his speech did you find more interesting? His focus on the importance of using cutlery, or his dislike of children talking to foreigners?
I think the most profound takeaway from the speech generally was how little it had to do with the title. So beginning this book on democracy, and it mainly just talking about how children are both the future and will provide this great role in re-educating their parents, but also they know nothing and need to be told exactly what to do. I think the bit about essentially the importance of using a fork and a spoon, he wasn't just cutlery in general. Fork and a spoon rather than eating with your hands shouldn't necessarily be considered bourgeois. And it really came across as if someone from Saddam's early childhood had criticised him for being bourgeois for the way he ate. And he's just got this ingrained prejudice now and this soft spot.
Chris, do you think using cutlery is a bourgeois endeavour?
Well, I'm currently eating a venison burger, which I feel is incredibly bourgeois. But as my contribution to resistance against Saddam, I'm going to continue drinking my Australian Riesling and eating my venison burger. But I think in terms of what Carrington touched on in terms of Saddam's early childhood, it was remarkably, even traumatic. I think his mother apparently believed that she was carrying Satan in her womb, and that the unborn Saddam had caused the death of his father and brother before he was even born. And as a result, he was sent to live with his uncle, who also massive Nazi sympathizer and author of a pamphlet called Three Whom God Should Not Have Created, those 3 being Persians, Jews, and flies, which sort of gives you a level of his anti-Semitism. And I think that's definitely a separate book for the Despot Bookshelf later on. But that sort of upbringing, the fact that that was his early childhood.
It's the sort of phrase where you literally, the unstable lean in the sort of corner of a pub, going just like, let me tell you what's wrong with Iraq. Well, the world. I think part of Saddam's policy was there to not be many Persians in Iraq.
Yeah, but if you think that was Saddam's upbringing, and actually, you're absolutely right in terms of his political policy of getting rid of the Persians in Iraq. That's why he spent so long fighting Iran, but also persecuting the Jews. They were the first people that Saddam actively persecuted before he even became president.
It shows just how much of an utter plagiarist he was. He's just like, I need a moustache. I'm going to have Stalin's moustache, and I'm going to Hitler hated the Jew. All right, so Jews first one. It's like it barely has an original thought.
I don't know about the rest of you, but one of the things that alarmed me the most in his speech was the really old, child informant vibes that Carrington touched on earlier. You should win over the adults through their children as well as by other means. Teach the student and the pupil to disapprove of his parents if he heard them talk about the state's secrets. Bannon, what was your take? This seems like this is serious spying on parents' territory, isn't it?
I think it is. The quote that stood out to me is where he says, "Teach him to object politely if he finds one of his parents squandering the state property." And I don't really know how that conversation pans out in the real world. Excuse me, father. Please do not squander the precious water of the Iraqi Bar Socialist Party.
It's a key way of actually an authoritarian state, enforcing their power. It's exactly the same thing that was used by the Stasi in East Germany, getting pupils to inform on their peers, on teachers, on parents. And actually, Saddam's initial obsession with talking about education, at first glance, it seems quite innocuous. But in this speech, once you take a second look at it, you can see other reasons for that. And it's so that he controls the minds of future citizens, and that those future citizens are loyal to him and him alone.
I mean, I think you should declare an interest here, Wits, because I read very clearly on page 29 and 30 of the speech. The job of a primary school teacher has priority of the secondary school teacher.
Well, I mean, as a qualified primary school teacher, I am more likely to agree with that statement than, say, Bannon, who's a qualified secondary school teacher. But the underlying reason for it, not really.
I'll stop you there, if I may. I think there's a secondary point, which is, firstly, you want to educate your children to inform on their parents to the state. The other one's a very telling quote where he says, you need to enforce education through discipline, and discipline will make a soldier stand still in the sun with his gun night and day. I got the impression that he's trying to breed this cadre of sort of mindless drones who will follow his policy militarily. And obviously that worked very well in 1991 and 2003, when within about 10 minutes of any firefight, all of his soldiers downed tools and legged it, as far as I recall.
In terms of getting the soldiers to stand firm and obey orders, that did work remarkably well, or if not successfully. One of the things that the US
how can it work remarkably well and not be successful?
Well, okay. One thing that
it worked an absolute dream. It didn't work at all, but it was fantastic.
It wasn't a military success by any means, but as far as getting the soldiers to do nothing until they are told, that's exactly what happened. The US military were amazed when they rolled into Iraq to discover so many bridges had been mined, but none of them had been detonated. So in the event of no orders, they did nothing.
Much of the speech does talk about indoctrinating children, but towards the end, it does start to come on to democracy a bit. I think the last 2 or 3 pages of the speech is where it actually gets down to brass tacks. I was very interested, though, just before we get onto that, I was very interested in his sentiment that man deep down wants justice, even when justice hurts him. Carrington, do you want justice, even when justice hurts you?
I think one of the things to take out from the speech is just like, what is a euphemism and what is not? Is he talking about justice, or is he Captain What I Reckon? And if your reckon goes against his, this is sin, this is injustice, this is wrong. Whereas everyone, in his view, should recognise that he's, of course, correct and put their individual desires aside. And deep down, that's what they really want. It's really creepy, actually. That's how he regards his population. It's just like, well, they say they don't really want to be told what to do and oppressed and have their families killed. But, I think deep down they recognise that it's right.
I think the other thing to pick up on here is the fact that these speeches, this one in particular, was written in July 1977. And so this is a couple of years before his purge of the party. He was still deputy. And so whilst there are these sort of undercurrents of his later and certainly more sinister actions, at face value, talking about people want fairness isn't
Blair-esque.
a dictatorial...
Blair-esque.
It's
equality.
Sort of the idea of many civilizations the world over that people need fairness and justice. It's almost like he's not yet played his hand.
Does he at any point in the speech, do he start to play his hand? Does he make any attempt to define what democracy is?
I would agree with you, Wits. This is a really weird speech, but I would like to turn our attention to Saddam's interpretation of Ba'athism. We must say that every citizen who is loyal to the homeland, loves his people and his work, and believes in the revolution is Ba'athist in his own way, even if he is not a member of the Ba'ath Party. And for me, I've termed that Protestant Ba'athism. I think Saddam is the Ba'ath Party's version of Martin Luther.
There's a quote. This episode of Despot's Bookshelf is sponsored by Carrington's Hair. Carrington's Hair is a new budget barbers based in urban Sheffield, specialising in giving unqualified barbers the chance to practice in a homely setting. For all of your haircutting needs in South Yorkshire, visit Carrington's Hair. Chris Whitwood. In Saddam's second speech, Democracy, a Comprehensive Conception of Life, Ba'athist democracy is outlined using the picture of a horse, which has been chopped in half. What do you think that dismembered horse is trying to represent?
Well, I think the image in question, it's a charcoal drawing of a rather bewildered horse, probably bewildered because it is, as you said, missing its hind quarters. First thing that I think it's important to recognise, it's entitled Horse Without a Rider, and that illustration was only done in 2012, some years after Saddam's actual death. Nevertheless, the idea of a horse without a rider is a running theme throughout this speech. The horse being Iraq and the rider being the Arab Bar Socialist Party. And it's the idea that the Arab Bar Socialist Party is the rightful rider of the horse that is Iraq. The statement, the Arab Bar Socialist Party has a special and exceptional role. It is the leading initiative in starting the revolution. And for this reason, the people and all national forces acknowledge the leading role. Is it enough to make the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party unauthoritarian? Yes, it is enough. And it's that idea that because everyone acknowledges the authority of the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party, it can't therefore be an authoritarian party.
So one of the things I would say, to offer my thoughts on this, one of the things I found most interesting about speech number 2, it felt more like a sincere attempt to outline what he saw as a democratic philosophy. Jack, what were your thoughts, Jack Bowman? What were your thoughts on how pro-media scrutiny and how pro-political complaint he seemed to be? That seems wild, doesn't it, when the regime in reality was chopping people's hands off for daring to question it?
Well, there's a very telling line in this when he's talking about the media. And he says, OK, we want to have a great relationship with the media. We don't want them to criticise us, but we want them to be free and to be free to do whatever they want. However, he then goes on to say, the proper way to make the media sector play its role in surveillance and public awareness. So, yes, he is bringing the media into the narrative, but he's doing that so that they can monitor and report back the activities of the public.
Well, I think that's echoed by the phrase, they are revolutionary and democratic means for making people aware and open-minded. That actually people need to be brought around and guided to the right decision. You know, people are free to make the right decision, but they need to be steered towards it. He uses the analogy of a teacher and a pupil, and actually it's one of the phrases that I could never stand in school is when teachers would use the phrase, oh, you need to make the right choices, as if there was an actual choice. You know, you had two choices, which were do as you're told or be punished. That's not proper freedom. That's not proper choice. And that's exactly what Saddam is advocating in this speech.
I think this was the most sincere attempt to outline an ideology. He clearly moved beyond indoctrinated children and wasn't yet furious with everything stage, as we see in speech number 3. I read this and thought that much of his conception of democracy doesn't relate to political structures. It relates to how humans relate to each other. And Saddam's democracy was all about human interaction, which is interesting given the later conduct of his son with various. But Jack, what's your take on how he actually conceives democracy in speech 2?
Part of the reason he tries to create this image of democracy being much smaller is the fact that it's a foregone conclusion how the big stuff is actually decided. There is the party, there is this, there is myself, he doesn't mention it, but it's this elephant in the room behind everything. Like, that's all taken care of. So democracy is just like it's like a vague way for people to relate to one another, but also kind of be weirdly subsumed together.
Do you think it links back to the previous idea of the emphasis on justice and fairness? people being listened to and being able to choose elements, but within a framework.
That's the thing, it's within a framework. You can have choices within this very, ultimately, what is quite a narrow band of still what are the correct decisions, what are the things that are deemed just or fair. So, yeah, you can have these conversations in this, what is actually quite an oppressive box. And I wonder if Saddam's own mind, the box he's imagined, it seems far larger to the citizen than it actually is in real life.
I think there's something really paternalistic about Saddam, which I found very, very interesting. And he says, because we do care for you, and we sometimes get tough with you and subject you to objective judgment, but only because we want to make you recognize the significance of collective work practices by democratic practice. And it's like this really weird left-wing stern father who's just like, yes, look, you are a bourgeois dog, but I'm telling you this because I love you and I want you to change for the better and for the future of the Ba'ath Party.
I mean, he's clearly just gaslighting his own party at this stage, sort of offering them what, on the face of it, seem like sort of supporting comments, but are actually very controlling in terms of what they do and how they think.
There is that undercurrent of dishonesty throughout, isn't there? Because I think in this speech,
it's almost like he's a bad person.
All the time. If this was a speech delivered by a Chris Whitworth, hypothetical politician Chris Whitworth, and you read this, you think, okay, I will take some of what you're saying here. I'm not sure if I agree with everything. You seem a bit authoritarian and a bit too into beating me and punishing me. But I see a philosophical conception. I see that you say you're anti-authoritarian. And I see that you speak about media scrutiny being great. And I see that you say we need to practice democracy or we lose ourselves. And I sort of take it. And I find it really difficult to marry that up with his actual conduct.
I think it's really important to remember, though, that when these speeches were made, he wasn't in charge of the party. He wasn't president of Iraq at this stage.
Two things, and agreeing with that. So firstly, he begins the speech, actually, we haven't really mentioned this, but he says the party is no longer an underground revolutionary movement. So they're moving the party from a band of comrades to something at scale. And I think the question that comes out of this is, this speech, we're sort of hacking it to bits and saying, if you look at what he actually did, he's a terrible man and he's just lying. Well, is he? Or are these actually the best laid plans which have gone awry? Or is this some kind of sinister rhetoric that's disguising his real motives? And that was a question that came out of this for me.
So I actually think there's something going on here. I think if you read it in a certain way, he's almost hinting to everyone what he's going to do, because there's a phrase which is used throughout this speech. He repeatedly uses this form of words: a certain number of losses will be needed. And it's littered throughout the speech, this idea of a certain number of losses being needed to ensure democracy. And let's not forget that he gave this speech about 18 months before his ultimate ascent to power, where he had half of the Ba'ath Party membership attend a conference and then be summarily executed to guarantee the loyalty of the other half. But it's almost a foreshadowing in that he speaks in his soaring rhetoric about guaranteeing democracy, but that a certain number of losses will be needed provides an incredible cover for what comes next.
I think there's definitely elements of truth in that, but at the same time, he talked about how it's important to show justice and fairness to citizens, because if you don't, they'll probably attempt to get rid of the source of injustice. And so I think it's important to remember as well that the Ba'ath Party had only been in power for a couple of years at this point. So how secure was he in his position?
Well, I think if you look at the final paragraph of the speech, it's really, really telling. And I don't know if anyone else got this, but he says, the position occupied by the revolution, the position occupied by the front, and the position occupied by us in vital areas of the revolution and the state has not been given to us. They were seized by force. Remind people of this, but don't be conceited. So I think that's linking to what you're saying and to what Craven was saying earlier, where he's acutely aware of the fact that they're a revolutionary movement. And they might need to remind the populace of that alongside all of their amazing democratic reform that they're almost certainly going to enact.
It's interesting you say that, Bannon, because I found that the two most interesting sentences, the last sentence and the first sentence. And he begins the speech by saying the question of democracy is an extremely complicated one. Carrington, do you think you got anything from this speech which takes you beyond thinking it's complicated in terms of what Saddam actually conceives democracy to be?
Well, he certainly got across a complexity. One of the things I really took away that's been picked up by Whitwood in particular is the idea that this was quite new. There's been a somewhat recent revolution, and still it's no longer the old guy. It's not like the Soviet Union in the 70s, where they're all like, well, in the 70s, half of them. It's still relatively young. They're still learning the ropes, but it is becoming incredibly bureaucratic in that time. So I never thought I would read the line, "We are all required to maintain and develop the conscious stimulus created by the Central Symposium on Productivity and all other marginal symposiums." It's like just dictator CPD on pain of gulag. It's a really weird, really weird mix.
Dictator CPD. Jack Bannon, let's move on to speech number 3. Democracy, a principle of practical necessity. I was a bit terrified when I read this speech, actually. Saddam was, like, you could feel the anger pulsating in his words. Saddam was clearly so furious when he wrote this. What do you think had upset him?
It's a good question, and it makes it a really entertaining speech, but you have to read between the lines a little bit. So what I gathered is that Saddam has prepared this lovely speech about sort of democracy, and I think this speech gives his best rhetoric about democracy and what he envisions democracy in Iraq to look like. But he's also super pissed because someone's actually stood against him in an election and has clearly either won a seat or has come close to winning a seat. And that group is bizarrely the Iraqi Bar Association. And some lawyers have teamed up against Saddam and have opposed him in an election. He makes several references to it. And he says, look, I feel uncomfortable when someone competes with the Arab Bar Socialist Party in the manner of what happened in the Bar Association. And I think his fury is palpable throughout the speech, and it makes it all the more delicious.
Chris Whitwood, did you pick up on the fury?
I mean, he's clearly furious. I was trying to work out what had actually happened. Was it elections to the Bar Association? Was it that there was other non-Ba'athist parties? Or was it counter-revolutionary parties? There seems to be sort of 3 tiers. So, those who are Baathists and members of the party and pro-revolution, those who aren't members of the party and are pro-revolution, and those who are anti-revolution. As long as you're pro-revolution, that's kind of fine. But
Protestant Ba'athism.
Yeah, if you open it out too much, though, it descends into liberal democracy, which he has a great tirade against, and uses phrases like, "Any one of us will have the right to strike with an iron fist against he who deviates from the policies laid down by the party leadership."
The number of times he keeps going on about loyalty, and it was this really weird, undefined thing that basically meant just like, oh yeah, you can compete, you can stand. I welcome it even. Of course, why not stand? As long as you have the general loyalty. And it's like, to what? I mean, we know in reality that's basically to him, but clearly something had really, really got under his skin. And then he just constantly listed all these different ways at which he was fine with people standing and contributing, but then had this one undefined attribute that basically he could just banhammer anyone he didn't like and just didn't define it in any way. And I mean, it clearly had pushed him over the edge a bit, because there's this part where he keeps on going on about
because he was fine beforehand.
He was just a young guy trying to live his life. What are you on about, Rich?
Well, he was having a nice time. I don't know about everyone else. Yeah, there was this one bit where he keeps going on about just like, so you've got like a Ba'athist with general loyalty and a non-Ba'athist with general, and they could be 2 points, and this guy has 12 points and 5. It's like this insane game show that no one else understands the rules of. Like, he just throws out this idea of these points ratings, doesn't know it at all. So it's like, well, this is sort of equal. This is sort of like, this was the point where if that was someone speaking in real time, you might give them a pass as just they're having a bit of a senior moment, or this is a reference I just don't get. But he wrote this.
Well, he's almost sort of foreseen the Chinese, social point system,
the social credit system.
Social credit system. He's seen it in the late 70s, but it's entirely within the realm of his own brain. And he doesn't seem to have told anyone else about that. So he's like, well, Ba'athist member A has 12 points, but non-Ba'athist member has 15. Who is the real meritocratic person that should take this job? And it's a strange, strange trip into Saddam's brain.
If we're defining democracy, could we say that Saddam's democracy is based on loyalty then?
He is definitely talking about the guiding role of the Arab Socialist Party as needing to, quote, prevent the growth of deviating trends, a trend that might lead to liberal democracy. And so this whole idea that, people should be free to choose as long as it's the right choice.
It's similar to the North Korean system of technically there are 3 different parties, and you can vote for any one of them. You can even vote against some of them, but you don't, and you know exactly why you don't. But yeah, that point system thing, I was just thinking it just makes him the Mr. Experian of the Mesopotamia. Just he's ranking all these citizens based on their...
One of the things I found really interesting about this speech, this was the only time, apart from in speech number 1 where he says children shouldn't speak to foreigners, that he referred to anything outside the Iraqi world. He clearly hated Anwar Sadat.
If we want to really define Saddam's view of democracy, it's this, and there's a couple of quotes that sort of bring this together, but he says, this people's democracy means isolating the influence of anti-revolutionary elements on a class basis and in their political and ideological stands and tendencies. So what Saddam's vision of democracy is democracy when you take away all of the people that disagree with you. His issue with Sadat is that he believes that Sadat has allowed liberal democracy to get in. And this is what happened to him when he allowed the Iraqi Bar Association to stand in a fair election, and he's been stabbed in the back, and he's deeply upset by this.
I think your
was it a
analysis
fair
is
election, or was it an election that was perceived as being too structured? Because he seemed to rail against that as much as he did against liberal democracy. We can't be seen to be corrupt. That kind of idea.
Seen to be is a very crucial phrasing there.
And
I think we're missing something more fundamental, though. I actually think we're missing something much more fundamental. And for me, the most interesting thing out of anything in all of his speeches comes when he's not talking about democracy, but he's talking about the role that Ba'athism can play within his Iraqi democracy in his eyes, where he says Ba'athism reactivates people's hidden resources, formerly restricted by depression, fear, and hesitation. I think that's so interesting that he almost sees Ba'athism and Pan-Arab National Socialism as a messianic movement that will free people from the shackles of society.
He was also massively egotistical. One of his other quotes, not in this book, but he said that the cradle of civilization is the Tigris and the Euphrates. Everyone is an Iraqi, and I am president of Iraq. He clearly sort of viewed himself not just as president of Iraq, but a rightful ruler of the world. This is a megalomaniac of massive delusion. After he defeated the Americans in the first Gulf War, and I say that not sarcastically, he genuinely touted it as a victory. He commissioned the building of an enormous mosque dedicated to the mother of all battles, which included 4 minarets which look suspiciously like Scud missiles. It had the big word "no" written on the roof as sort of a shouting at the sky against the Americans. And but its sort of crowning glory was a copy of the Quran, which was apparently written in Saddam's own blood. This is a man who thinks that he is the centre of the universe.
If only had gone a bit further.
Alan, you have a different view. You don't feel Saddam was Masonic. You don't feel that he's Ba'athism as an ideology to save humanity.
Well, no, not necessarily. I broadly agree with you, and but I think what I'd add is that from the same quote that you used, he says, "Keeping the source of anxiety and fear in the life of the citizen, the people, like a nightmare threatening their life and future, will seriously reduce their power to the weakest state possible." And I think this is bringing us back to what we were talking about the second speech. That question of, is he a megalomaniacal dictator in waiting in 1977, or does this build over time? And I would argue that's evidence that he is maybe not. Maybe he does genuinely believe this, and it's only later that the difficulties of the role, but his belief in Ba'ath socialism, lead him into this kind of dictatorship. I don't know.
That's an interesting quote, actually, because when I initially read it, I read it as if to say keeping the people suppressed is a bad thing. But he doesn't specify that it's bad. He just says it will keep them weak. And so, to what extent is he saying, we shouldn't do it? Or how much is it saying this is a tool at our disposal if necessary?
Yeah. And I think to add to that, towards the end of the speech, and contradicting myself entirely, he talks about this extreme centralization. He says that he wants to prepare psychological and ideological conditions for the exercise of centralization with an iron will when deviation occurs, which is perhaps telling us that he has pretty clear views on what he's going to do to people who oppose him in the future.
I think it is one of the most anti-devolution speeches I've ever read. Also with the idea of just like, oh, well, obviously civilization was born here between our lovely rivers. That is Iraq. We're all Iraqis, therefore I am... And, well, you can see this attitude when it comes to, say, Kuwait, or at least the oil-producing bit Persia and beyond. It's just like, yeah, like the idea of there being particularly fixed or even sort of culturally defined borders, he just has no respect or conception for that whatsoever. It's just, what can I reasonably get control of? For it to be as clear as it is this early on, you can really see just how extreme he gets when he's actually got extreme power.
So there we have it. Saddam's 3 speeches on democracy. And I don't think any episode of Despot's Bookshelf would be complete if we didn't all now consider, on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being relatively sane as far as these insane books goes, and 5 being, my goodness, that's alarming. On a scale of 1 to 5, where do we place it?
I think you need to revisit the definition of that scale. Oh my. Oh, you clutched in your pearls, Craven.
Chris Whitwood,
yes.
Where would you place this on the basket case scale, 1 to 5?
I think because it was written before he'd committed his sort of large-scale atrocities, and he's sort of trying to seem relatively affable. And you did caveat with, on the scale of these books, I'm going to go with a conservative 2 baskets.
2 baskets from Whitwood. Carrington, what do you think?
Well, I feel that so we're doing a scale from 1 to 5. I think the 1, the fact that to be a dictator and do these things, you can't be mentally normal. So there's a sort of a minimum 1, and I don't think Saddam's that far above that minimum, to be honest. So we're getting a good flavour of paranoia, the thing about cutlery, a bit weird. I think I'd do a 1.5. I don't think he's that much of a bug. I think he's wrong, but I don't think he's that mad.
Nice save
yet.
there.
Bannon, where would you place him on the 1 to 5 scale?
I think I'm going to agree with the boys here. I think if you're looking for an absolute whack job, he's definitely a hot prospect, but he's not quite there yet. He's still a young man. He's cutting his teeth. And I also look, we've got the founder of Protestant Ba'athism. I think in some ways he's an unlikely feminist icon. I think I'm going to give Saddam Hussein 2 baskets.
The feminist icon is an idea we really need to explore in a future episode.
Now, I think I agree with you. I was disappointed in some ways reading Saddam Hussein's On Democracy. I thought the title was so absurd, this would be insane. And I know we'll come to some genuinely insane books in the weeks ahead. But for me, this was, apart from the odd digressions into cutlery, into talking to foreigners, into his gross dislike of Anwar Sadat, this was, for the most part, a reasonable attempt to define an ideology. It was clearly the case that he didn't pursue this ideology. Reading Saddam Hussein railing against authoritarianism is ironic in a way I can't even verbalise. But taking the book by itself, I would give it a 2.
Yeah.
I'd just like to add something as well, is he does seem mostly, for the most part, aware of what his immediate audience is, as well as what the wider audience could be. There's a degree of sanity there. He's trying to put on a veneer. He's trying to excuse what he's doing. He's trying to put a spin on it.
An element of self-awareness.
There's thought to it that just isn't present in, as I said, as Arnie said, in the weeks ahead, we're going to come to some incredibly interesting people and products.
So as an overall review, that's Saddam Hussein's On Democracy, a basket rating, thanks to Carrington's awkward decimal, of 1.875 baskets. Not that crazy.
A fine decimal there.
I would argue that the Saddam is 2 baskets, because I believe in median averages.
Yeah, or mode indeed.
You believe that Carrington should be able to. You believe that Carrington should be able to choose his number, but only within the framework of Arnie Bar Socialism.
I don't think we should validate Carrington's weird decimalisation. By including him in the score.
You should come down on him with an iron fist.
With either 1.87 or 2 baskets, we say goodbye to Saddam Hussein's On Democracy. Goodbye to you all, and look forward to having you listen to us on the next episode. Goodbye.